And a very good afternoon to everyone who's joined us this afternoon for Defence in North Queensland Townsville Enterprise webinar series in Unlock the North. My name's Wade Kiers, the Director of Regional Development and Investment at Townsville Enterprise. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We've got a wonderful panel to talk all things defence. There's no doubt about it that Townsville is a very proud garrison city and is one of Australia's prime strategic defence regions. It's uniquely positioned for mounting operations into the southeast of Asia and the Pacific. It's home to one of the largest defence bases in the country, which is strategically positioned between two of the ADF's prime training areas in Shoalwater Training Area and the Townsville Field Training Area. Additionally, a ready workforce of veterans with security clearances and understanding of defence requirements also reside in the region. Over 15,000 Defence Force and their dependents reside in Townsville, making up approximately 8% of Townsville's population. We often hear about defence industry, but what exactly is it? And more importantly, how can Townsville play its role and use its natural advantages for the benefit of security for our nation? Today, you'll hear from our expert panel on what key areas in defence industry the region is perfectly placed to capitalise on. You'll hear about the Townsville Defence Strategy. You'll also hear about world-leading simulation and training that's happening right here in Townsville, and how with the right government investment and policy framework can take it to the next level. And finally, you'll hear about the importance of Northern Australia to the nation's security. We have a panel of experts here today that will answer your questions in a panel after a few presentations. Of course, you can ask questions through the Zoom function, so we encourage you to do that throughout the course of the next hour. I'd like to welcome our panel today, and a big welcome to David Burke, from many years of experience in the Army, but from the Defence Engagement Officer at the Townsville City Council. Hi, David. Also joining him right beside him is Mark Horn, the Director of Strategic Development for Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia from Quebec Defence. G'day, Mark.
G'day.
Also with them in the room is John Caligari, AO. Welcome, John.
Hello.
Very well. Joining us is Dr. John Coyne, the head of Northern Australia's security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. G'day, John.
Hey, Wade.
And also to Tony Tucker from the Business Development Manager at JCU Connect as well. Hey, Tony.
Hey, Wade.
Look, at this stage, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners in which the land upon which we meet, and pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. Now, I'll hand over to David Burke, who's going to present on the Townsville City Council Townsville Defence Strategy. David's a retired Australian Defence Force officer with over 30 years experience in command, staff and training appointments, including commanding officer of the Army Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Commandant of the Army Aviation Training Centre and Australian Defence Attaché to Pakistan. David was involved in projects and programs successfully managed, including the raising the 6th Aviation Regiment and consolidated supporting contracts for flying and technical training at the Army Aviation Training Centre, including the Singapore Air Force Training Agreement for helicopter training. David's also had significant roles in establishing aviation support and special operations planning and conducting multiple aviation operational deployments and coordinating Australian defence engagement with Pakistan. He's now employed by the Townsville City Council as Defence Engagement Officer after retiring from the Army in 2019 and moving back to Townsville. It's great to have you back, David. I'll hand over to you to present on the Townsville Defence Strategy.
Thanks very much, mate. It's a pleasure to be here, Wade. So the North Queensland Defence Strategy, it's interesting. I've been asked a few times recently, why would a local regional council be involved in setting up a defence strategy, which is something we think of at national level? Well, it's pretty simple, really. If you look at it at the moment, defence is a very important part of what's going on in our national debate. It's important. It's one of the few areas that hasn't had a significant downturn with the economy at the moment. And what we're looking to do is to try and understand how we can deliver sustainable socioeconomic outcomes for Townsville, but also support Australia's defence and national security requirements. So our strategy, looking at what we've been doing, and the idea has been to understand what are our strengths and what is it that we have to offer defence. Because it's no good with there's been a lot of interest. We've seen that there's just been a strategic update delivered. There's a very large budget. People are talking about lots of money, but you know, defence is business, is defence of the nation. It's not about economic support for the regions. So we have to understand what it is and how we can fit into the picture. So it's important for us to look at what it is that we have to offer defence, but understanding is what is it that defence needs. And out of that, we can come up with a mutually beneficial agreement where we can work with defence to give them what they need. And the strategy has basically been to identify what we've called high payoff target opportunities. Next one. Throughout this, when we've looked at it, there's a recurring theme. And if we look at what is it that Townsville is good at, where are our strengths? And it's basically as a forward operator, as a mounting base for defence on the East Coast. As Wade said, we have a lot of assets here. We have Army's largest army base, operational army base. We have a joint user airfield. We have training ranges. We have the port. We have everything you need. And there's been a long history that goes right back to the Second World War, where the US raised the 5th Air Force here. And from that, we've always been an area to mount operations. And it's interesting, you know, with this change in the strategic environment, Townsville is sitting front and centre now in the Pacific Step Up and what's going on in the Pacific and Southeast Asian regions. Thanks, mate. So what we did in looking at this, we've identified what we called the high payoff targets. Where are our strengths? And there's a list of those there. I'm not going to go to all of them in detail in this presentation, the time I have, but it's interesting. There have been a number of studies, and all of those studies that have gone on in the last couple of years have identified that one of our key strengths is in our defence simulation training capability here. We're very fortunate that we have Cubic Australia. They're our only prime who are headquartered in the north of Australia. And together with the Combat Training Centre, they are providing national and if not world-leading simulated training, simulated enabled training. Mark will talk about that in more detail as we go through, but we'll talk about some of those opportunities. Another big one that we're looking at the moment is obviously maritime and amphibious. We have all of the amphibious capabilities here, and I'll talk about that more in detail, and that's an important thing for us. Army aviation is an interesting one I'll go through. And of course, everybody is aware that the Singaporeans, we've got the Australian-Singapore Military Training Initiative, and for the next 25 years, there's a $2.25 billion project for training in Queensland. Thanks. What we've looked at, one of the first major projects that we identified was, we knew that there was, one of our strengths was in the simulation area, and through the Townsville City deal is an agreement from the federal government basically trying to understand and help the Townsville through all 3 levels of government. It was identified through there that it's not just in defence, but also in health and knowledge. And we're talking about the university, the hospital. There's a real confluence here where we can leverage the expertise we have in the area. And we started out looking at things like simulation-enabled training, things like emergency services, health and disaster management. But it quickly became clear to us that there was also a lot more potential around things like research development and human performance studies. So we are well developed in a proposal. We've just done a feasibility study and we're about to go to a business case on a $72 million project to construct a simulation centre that brings together defence, education, academia, and health. But I'll leave that detail to Mark shortly, and he'll be able to talk a lot more about this exciting initiative. Next one. Okay, amphibious capability and port upgrade. At the moment, the Queensland government are funding an upgrade to the port. There's a $1.7 billion project. I'm sure all the locals have seen that. We're starting to dredge and make a wider channel, build up the port. There's an opportunity here at the moment, and we've got a group together who are working to talk to Defence and understand where are the opportunities where Defence can be involved so that we can leverage what's going on at the moment and solve a lot of problems and answer a lot of questions. In the latest force structure review, there is talk of investment into ports. And rather than waiting until later when Defence has to go and maybe start constructing something from scratch, there are a lot of opportunities to understand where we can work together and the synergy so that the sum is greater than all the parts. And I'm sure that John Coyne will talk about that in detail we go through, but these are the sorts of projects where we really have to think carefully about how investment in defence and through other parts of government can actually help nation building in the north. Next one. The Australian Army Aviation is an interesting one. We have a situation where we have one combat aviation brigade, and all those little colours there represent where parts of that brigade are distributed around Australia. The red one there is the headquarters, the orange are the flying regiments and the training and maintenance, situated over an area greater than the continental US. It's a really inefficient system, and we know that Defence have been looking at how that they can bring that together and some of the opportunities there. Townsville has a lot to offer. We already have the majority of Army aviation in Townsville, and this is the next one, thanks, Mark. And if you, in the latest strategic update and force structure review, that document instructed Defence to look at replacing the Tiger Army helicopter, and that decision will be made very shortly. And if that happens, there's an opportunity with a reset. It directs that there's continued operation of a multi-role triple lift helicopter and continue operation of Chinook. And there's a good chance that those assets will be located perhaps in Townsville. And there's a very good reason for that. And it's around the opportunities for training, the weather, 322 days of sunshine, but importantly, close to an amphibious capability, close to ships, close to a C-17 capable strip. But the opportunities there, if you start to bring together these sorts of organisations, then you can build and invest in defence industry around it. Because these are all high-tech jobs that require, skilled and experienced workers. Next, thanks, mate. And of course, the Singapore opportunity. As you said, that's going to be over 25 years. There's going to be Singaporeans who are going to be coming here to train for up to 14 weeks a year. There may be an opportunity to attract other countries if the national government decides so. But there are certainly going to be a lot of opportunities there and there's $800 million about to be invested in building the Greenvale range. And I understand a large majority of that will go to local companies. But we're also looking at the ongoing sustainment of that over the next 25 years and logistics support. Makes sense. So why a strategy? Basically what we have now is a unified regional strategy where we can get everybody in the region understanding and business working together, and we're pursuing high payoff targets that we've looked at that are both beneficial for defence in the region. Instead of going to defence and saying, there are tough economic times here, it would be really good if you could come and invest some money here. We now have a message where we can go to defence and say, look, these are the areas that we know that you need to work on. This is where we think we can help you. So what we can have is a logical and meaningful advocacy and conversation with those decision makers. Because at local level government, we don't make decisions and we don't have budgets. But what we're trying to achieve, and if you look at some of these things like the port, Army Aviation, the simulation in particular, and some of these areas, they're all high-tech, high-skilled jobs. And one of the problems that we all know in Townsville, we've had a cyclical economy, we've had boom bust whenever the mining goes down. There's no good educating kids and putting people through into science and technology and high-skilled jobs, high-skilled qualifications if there aren't the jobs there for them. So what we want to achieve through developing defence industry is developing Northern Australia with meaningful defence industry and high-tech jobs. And with that, I'll now talking about high-tech jobs and that sort of area, I'll hand over to Mark Coyne, who will talk about this next initiative that is very close to being ready to go. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, David. And I'm just going to share the screen on that second presentation. Okay. Hopefully those slides are coming through now. I'm the Strategic Development Director for Cubic in Townsville in Australia. We have been here since 2006. Cubic won a contract for the instrumentation of the Army's Combat Training Centre in 2003 and then delivered that through 2005 from basically New Zealand. And we established an operation here in Townsville. And then around 2006, 2007, because Cubic had won air combat manoeuvre instrumentation contracts, we decided to start a national entity. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Cubic what Cubic does and what simulation and training means. I'm going to talk about the value of it to the region and to developing regions in the country. And I'm going to give a few more details about the Spark. So Cubic Corporation is a New York Stock Exchange listed American-based company. We are global in the respect that we provide electronic e-ticketing systems such as Opal Card, Oyster Card, and if you've travelled on big city transportation systems, you're familiar with that technology. In Australia, it's a significant business and we operate with that as a shared service sister business. We work in the defence part of the business, which covers off on command control computers, communications, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, or C4ISR is the acronym. We're pretty big on acronyms. And also a training and simulation business that wraps together around smart networks for both training and command and control. As I mentioned, Cubic Defence Australia was started in Townsville, but it's spread nationally. Our role is to provide high-end training, simulation and instrumentation services and support. So technology such as networking, the blending of live virtual constructive simulation, the ability to have a top-tier security cleared workforce, which often requires us to develop people from base level skills through experience on the job and additional training to the level of proficiency in supporting defence high-end collective training and providing the simulation and technical support that's required. We also have some direct training capabilities, and we're a registered training organisation, and we have an ex-military dominant workforce, over 63% veterans. But one of the things that we're looking to do is to increase our diversity, and we've been pretty successful in that. Cubic's programs in Australia span the joint space at the Australian Defence Simulation Training Centre, or the Joint Combined Branch in Canberra, with the air combat manoeuvring instrumentation for FAST, and some of their training and logistics planning operations in Sydney. Then up in the land environment, we provide the Combat Training Centre live instrumentation system and also some training services. So our contracts span Army, Navy, Air Force. We also provide services to New Zealand and Singapore. We see some significant opportunities courtesy of our position in Townsville, being proximal to the large base, but also being this fantastic area for field training, which is available to other countries to use. And that, first of all, we've grown a very significant technical repair capability here. We've actually established a high frequency communications repair depot. It's the only one outside of San Diego in the world. And we're performing high frequency communications systems repairs for the National Defence High Frequency System and the National Air Services Australia High Frequency System. And we have potential to expand that in New Zealand and in Asia. We're developing a long-term evolution or LTE-based communication capability, and that's mobile phone architecture. But this one is private. It doesn't make phone calls. It's distributed high bandwidth, low latency, live virtual and constructive and augmented reality data around the training range to better enable forces to prepare for operations. The very first 4/5G LTE communications range is being built at the moment in Townsville Field Training Area, and that will undergo a 2-year risk reduction activity from December of this year. And we're very excited about the prospect that private LTE can bring to experimentation and research in the future. Cubic is a company that works with many other companies. We're a mid-tier size company. We're all about attracting the ecosystem of target systems providers, command and control companies to actually relocate some of their functions to Townsville, not just their field support representation, but also some of their engineering function and the management and business growth functions. So we've been working very closely within this Townsville Enterprise, Townsville City Council, Queensland State Government and federal government-led effort. And as David said, we're enjoying the fact that there is an aligned strategy upon which we can launch and prove ourselves. So we have a number of opportunities around field test and operational test and evaluation, and we see them coming to fruition through the Spark, which I'll talk about in a second. But first of all, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what a company being invested in by the Defence can do for regional Australia. This is a little snapshot of Cubic's profile, about 150 people, and then another 150, 160 surge. Spread throughout the East Coast predominantly. You can see we have a significant presence in Townsville with 54 personnel. We spend almost all of our money in Australia. So around 94% of our revenue is spent in Australia. And so that's a really good thing. Although it's a US-based or owned company, we receive overhead and we receive investment dollars from the parent company to invest here in Australia. And we're in a great situation in that because we're using mostly commercial off-the-shelf technologies, almost all of our money is distributed to local businesses. And you can see it in the bottom right, when we commenced operations in 2007, we started with very low revenues, sub $5 million. Obviously, we did start with zero to begin with, but now we're well up in the 30s and 40s and low 40s, that is. And we've had good, steady, profitable growth since then. And I think at the beginning, people would have said we couldn't have done it relying on a supplier network that's based heavily in regional and North Queensland. But in actual fact, we've proven that to be untrue, and North Queensland has delivered in spades. This slide seeks to talk a little bit about the value of a company like Cubic, and there should be other companies. Our role is to attract those other companies to the regions. Sorry about a number of words. But we have a contract for the Combat Training Centre Live Instrumentation System. It is laser zone on steroids for the Army, and it involves a lot of virtual simulation applied in a live environment. It's depicted in the diagram to the left-hand side. It moves around the country, and although it's based in Townsville, it supports the Army in places like Shoalwater Bay Training Area, in Mount Bundy Training Area in Northern Territory, and Coltana in South Australia. So it's interesting to track the number of small businesses and the amount of money that is spent just from this one program, which is valued between $12 and $15 million per year. And of that, a significant amount of the money, basically 20%, goes to very small businesses in regions as we move it around the country. And I've got a quotation there from our colleague, John Coyne, who will speak in a moment about the importance of and the method by which Defence can actually perform investment in the regions by investing in companies like ours and our operation and awarding contracts on that basis. So I mentioned the growth in complexity and demand for simulation in the military training environment, and David did as well. Singapore, New Zealand, the United States, and particularly the United States Marine Corps are all placing demand on Australia to deliver better replicated, complex military environments. We're building the integrated training environment for the Australian Army Combat Training Centre in Townsville at the Townsville Field Training Area, as I mentioned. And these contracts have produced, some really great outcomes for us. We've been awarded an additional contract in Singapore, and we have. This is a depiction of the build that is going on. This is just last week. You can see the platforms and cabinets for a 5G standards compatible, but 4G frequency-based private LTE network, which will cover off on Townsville Field Training Area. We've also been awarded a contract for networking in New Zealand, which we're performing the training and support here from Townsville for that contract for the New Zealand Defence Force. David mentioned the North Queensland Simulation Park, or Spark. This is an initiative to take some of that operational test and evaluation and to apply it for the benefit of defence, health and academic research. We get a privileged position under this plan on the edge of the barracks, but also conveniently located between the Townsville University Hospital and James Cook University. This is a render of 2 stages of the Spark. The Spark is the white building depicted at the top right-hand side of the blue box, and it will consist of a large reconfigurable space that is heavily instrumented, research space, a medical and simulation centre, and amenities for collaboration. And then it'll expand out from there. And we do see industry and an ecosystem of companies moving into this location because of its privileged position, its access to operational test and evaluation, and its access to defence research funding. So some of the features that will go into the Spark will be a clinical simulation centre that is the equivalent, or if not better than, a big city hospital's clinical simulation centre. And it'll be able to cope with the throughput requirement for undergrad training, emergency services, as well as the current contract that Cubic operates for military care of the battle casualty training. We'll have a very large, advanced situational training and experimentation space, a very large, so a UAS, an unmanned aerial system arena, high fidelity tracking with technology that's the equivalent of OptiTrack, 3D positioning cameras, and ultra wideband RF tracking internally, as well as a very high-end immersive display, LED panels with a powerful simulation engine, and a secure data portal to allow researchers to gain access to their data without having to go through a third party. A significant demand is placed on command and control training as well, and decision superiority. We're collaborating with a number of other partners, including the University of South Australia and University of New South Wales, but led by James Cook University, critically, and the Defence Science Technology Group. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present on Cubic in Townsville, and I'll now hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. And I should acknowledge that you've been with Cubic from 2006, when it was just, what, 1 or 2 employees, and have grown the company. It shows that a company, a global company, can actually set up their Australian headquarters in Townsville, which I think is a wonderful success story. And that simulation part, which we'll speak more on during the question and answer, I think that's an exciting initiative, and the potential and opportunities for not only keeping our young kids in region and being able to study and then work in those more high technology, high paid jobs. I think it's a wonderful initiative. Thanks very much, Mark. It's now time to welcome Dr. John Coyne, who's the head of Northern Australia's security programs at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's the author of The Role of Strategic Intelligence in Law Enforcement, and has published widely on Northern Australia, national security and organised crime. He's worked in intelligence and national security for over 25 years. He's been an intelligence professional at tactical, operational and strategic levels across a range of military, regulatory, national security and law enforcement organisations. John, I'll hand over to you to talk on the importance of, I guess, Northern Australia to Australia's security.
Thanks, Wade. Look, before I get into that normal Canberra policy wonk discussion of that high level stuff, really, colleagues, what I really want people to do is go away with 4 clear messages from this, and they are as follows. The first one is that we face an unprecedented period of strategic uncertainty in Australia, and that's going to get worse over time, and certainly for the next 10 years. Secondly, is that Defence wants a scalable industry in Northern Australia that can be ready at a moment's notice to support its various contingencies. But at the same time, we want a secure Northern Territory, Northern Australia. Now, with that in mind, I think my second point here is quite clear, is that economically and socially prosperous Northern Australia is a safe and secure one which can support defence. Next is that that's really only possible through thinking big. And I'll talk about this quite a bit. And this is why I'll talk a lot about nation building over the next several minutes. And finally, and it's really, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is a not-for-profit bipartisan think tank and we're there to provide contested policy, which is why we have a Northern Australia program. So with those four things, if you take nothing else away and you take those, that's important. But in that more detail, and this is the key piece of, I guess, in that strategic piece, which is this, we are seeing great power competition playing out across the globe. Now, the last time that occurred was in the Cold War. And at the time, for those who grew up at the time or around then, there was a real existential threat, the possibility of thermonuclear war. While I'm not saying that's the case now, what I am saying is that we've never seen this heightened level of or period of great power competition between the Chinese and the Americans before, and it is playing out on a day-to-day basis. Now, during the Cold War, we were, and this will have upset some people, we were a strategic backwater. All of a sudden, though, right now, Australia finds itself front and centre. We're key terrain in the middle of the Indo-Pacific. And there's a clear message with that, which is all of a sudden, national security and defence has taken on an all new priority. Now, for those who are in the defence industry or who are focusing on this in terms of Northern Australia, now I define Northern Australia as everything above the line of north of 26 degrees south. So if you draw a line across the bottom of the Northern Territory and go either side, that's what I consider Northern Australia. The problem is that right now is the vast majority of our defence thinking, especially around Northern Australia, I should say, is really deeply rooted in 1980s thinking. And we've seen a slow move away from that. We've seen a real focus here that in terms of logistics and industry, that, you know, market forces will naturally support the ADF when it needs to. Now, I'm going to give a couple of Northern Australian examples along the way to highlight what I'm talking about here. Exercise Pitch Black, major air exercise raised and conducted in Northern Australia. A whole range of international players fly in for it. Consistently, the exercise is called off a day or two early because the official line is all operational outcomes are achieved, but they get dangerously low on fuel because the fuel storage within and bulk fuel storage within the Northern Australia is precariously low, and even with 2 years' notice, can't hold enough fuel and jet fuel there in order to have those large-scale exercises, let alone a prolonged period of operations. And it highlights how, you know, market forces don't, for defence and national security, don't necessarily put the right investments that are going to build a safe and secure Northern Australia. At the same time, and I think, you know, taking on board what David's spoken about and taking on board as well what Mark's spoken about, defence finds itself in a very precarious situation. So it increasingly faces a budget with increasing capital investment. So $52 billion worth of submarines have rapidly become $82 billion worth of submarines. And they've got a range of other similar projects. We've also facing down in the medium term, if you look at forward estimates, a drastic reduction probably in defence spending or some downwards pressure on it. Now, if that was to occur, that expense will be taken away from operational expenditure. So that's a sort of expenditure that's taken and invested in the local community in terms of infrastructure. So we very much see a defence organisation that is increasingly inwardly focused. Now, I'm going to give you a second example of this and how it plays out in terms of big thinking. So for a number of years, RAF-based Tyndall, probably one of our most important, if not most important, airfield bases in Australia, especially for our fighter capability. There was a decision to enhance the ability to resupply for logistic purposes. So that's jet fuel, ammunition, and general logistical supplies, to develop a rail spur that goes from the township of Katherine all the way through to RAF-based Tyndall. Now, behind the scenes, the local government in Katherine had decided what a fantastic idea, and they would develop an agricultural hub and distribution point to promote local businesses. And that was a fantastic idea. At the same time, the Northern Territory government looked at that investment and said, longer term, there's a real possibility of running an east-west rail corridor to provide further access to the aquaculture and a range of other factors. Then, all of a sudden, in April this year, in the middle of COVID-19, when government was speaking about the need to increase investment, and investment in critical infrastructure, Defence made the decision rather quietly in a backroom committee room, saying that they would no longer invest in putting a rail spur there. Now, that occurs against the backdrop of a Northern Australian investment facility that is drastically underspent, and despite the fact that the actual project itself across the board was a win-win from everything from national security all the way through to the local community and business. Which brings me to ASPI. We see this as a nation building activity. We see that, and beginning of 2019, the Northern Territory government provided research sponsorship to ASPI to establish a Northern Australia program. And I must say, a Northern Australia program, not an NT program. So that north, the 26 degrees up. The idea was to create a centre that was going to specifically focus on national security research for Northern Australia, with three broad ideas. So maintaining a better, stronger policy discussion. And so, which is a lot of Canberra wank words for what we really wanted to do was make sure people didn't forget. So in the offices of Russell offices in Canberra, through to the Minister's offices and through the Prime Minister's office, there was a constant discussion around national security and the Northern Australia. Secondly was to develop a far more modernised way of thinking about the north of Australia. Before I came on, I was speaking to Wade, and we would go backwards and forwards around this issue of, Northern Australia white paper that was introduced, and 5 years later, where are we at, etc. What I wanted to do was create a different way to look at this national security spend, looking at NAIF and looking at Defence and their activities in the north. And along with that was situating this national security discussion more broadly than just a defence discussion. So what was happening at the state and territory level is across the three northern jurisdictions is that so much of this, because of economic reasons, so much of this relies, or this discussion relies on troop numbers on the ground and local spend, that there's not enough time to really discuss this big nation building. Now, so what we do in order to deliver that, in addition to doing events like these, we produce a series called The North of 26 Degrees South, which is a series by authors from all over Northern Australia, a range of topics, of which I know General Caligari has written, David's written for us as well. And what we're trying to do there is maintain momentum, so that for two reasons. The first one is that we get these discussions up there on everything from rare earth materials through to ports. Secondly, that people and the idea of Northern Australia in national security circles doesn't drop from their minds. To put it quite simply, so that those making decisions in places like Russell offices in terms of big policy, it's front and centre of their mind is what will be the commentary that comes out from that, or from North of 26. Secondly, we undertake a range of, large applied policy research. Now, applied policy, by that is, I have academic qualifications, but I'm not an academic. My job is to do things like, our first one was Strong and Free, which looked at, first major research report, which really looked at how could we reconceptualise the north of Australia, so that we had a different narrative than what was around in the 80s. We came up with that broad concept of the north as a forward operating base. And I note Mark used some of that language around an ecosystem, which includes local government, state and territory government, includes business. The second report looked at fuel security in the Northern Australia, specifically a case study of the Northern Territory. The third report that we've got, which will come out in the coming weeks, really is, and it's titled Thinking Big. What we're trying to do now is say, well, Defence is going through a certain period of time in its spending. Now, as a result of that, its capacity to invest in the kinds of infrastructure and to maintain a scalable defence industry across the north isn't quite there. But there are a whole heap of other factors at play. Now, what I'm going to do is paint a picture, and it's a hypothetical of Townsville's port to give you an example of how this plays out in a real term. So right now we have the following. So we have a national government that's looking at putting economic stimulation packages together. It's looking at critical infrastructure. On the other side of it, we've got a port that is going to be updated in Townsville. On the other side of it, we've got Defence announcing that they're going to go and establish a new amphibious base, most likely, I guess, in Townsville, based on 2RR's location. Next is that we've got Angus Taylor and his energy department looking around going, we need to increase fuel storage and oil storage in this country. So we're going to need to build new storage. All of those things together, in their independent silos, are lovely pieces of work at various stages of development. What I imagine you is if you can sit there and create an economy of scale and bring all of those things together to use it, come up with a single strategy. And again, I guess, to be quite frank, is I've been in Canberra long enough to know that those things are incredibly difficult to do. So I'm not naive, but what I am saying is if there was ever a time where that sort of thinking can occur, it will occur at a time when we're facing off a national emergency around COVID, which has shown us that we have clear problems with our supply chains and resilience, and where we have an enduring national security threat with a range of possible defence contingencies in Northern Australia. So with that in mind, I will be continuing those sorts of discussions, and I certainly encourage those who are listening to have a look at North of 26 degrees south, to have a look at our research papers and become part of that process. And that, you know, it is in fact a process of getting people to think bigger and think in a different way. Now, there's, in terms of policy, and I'll add this, and in the last sort of 24 hours, we've had some discussions around this, which is the Northern Australian Investment Fund. You know, there has been some change, or likely to be some change through legislation that will make it easier to obtain NAIF funding, but I'm still not convinced in general the things we're talking about here that NAIF is the perfect way to solve that. So with that in mind, what I'm sort of saying is also looking at those issues that unfairly put the Northern Australia on an uneven keel, which is, you know, you can't put a user pays model into the Northern Australia. So once you get past Noosa, it's really hard to build, you know, all the sorts of infrastructure that you need, because user pay models don't work. So it's those sorts of discussions that we'll continue having. So on that point, I think I'll hand back to Wade, because that gets us back on time, and we'll go to allow people some time for questions.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Appreciate your input and presentation this afternoon. As I said, questions, please feel free to submit your questions. And I would bring in the rest of our panel at this stage as well. As I said, General John Caligari, retired 3-star General. John, 36 years in the Australian Defence Force, including command positions in Townsville. You know, of course, you were commander of 3rd Brigade at Laverack Barracks number of years ago. I want to ask you about defence industry, John, and what it was like potentially back then to what it is now and what it could be, and why, you know, real defence industry in Townsville is important.
The defence industry's come a long way in the last 10 years since I was commander of 3 Brigade. There's much more involvement now with industry content, making sure that Australian content is involved. And I think we're getting smarter about how we're spending our money. For example, the sort of thing that John Coyne's talking about, if we were doing things in regions and in areas where they're smarter to do. I think defence is also starting to get to that point as well. And I think the other thing that's relevant is the conversation that's going on in Canberra right now about what is a national security strategy. Really all of these things, in order to bring those 3 things together, a city deal is one thing, but doing something along the lines of a national security strategy, of which industry is considered one of the fundamental inputs of capability for defence, would really make a big difference. So it's those sorts of things starting to come together have come a long way in 10 years.
Thanks, John. Mark, I guess that simulation part, I guess your company is a prime example of what's been able to create like an industry in the region. And I guess this just takes it to a new level, but it also works in with the hospital and the university to do simulation training in the health field as well.
Yes, that's right. There's training and research. So there's a throughput requirement when it comes to medical simulation training, where we needed to train a lot of people in a limited period of time to gain a level of proficiency with their clinical skills. And simulation lends itself to obtaining that initial level of proficiency. And particularly then we can take it to the next level with some highly immersive, high fidelity simulations, which are perhaps shocking, perhaps induce high levels of stress, require effective communication and control, as well as mastery of their subject matter expertise. So the military has been enjoying, some pretty good high fidelity training, and it's available in certain areas in clinical areas in Australia. But I think it fits very well with James Cook's University's training profile and their regional reach. And I think it'll be a really good feature to improve upon with initiatives like the Spark.
And just on that, thanks, Mark. I'll bring in Tony Tucker from JCU Connect and that training and those skills. I guess this is a big part about keeping our kids in the region. I mean, we've been doing a little bit in pushing and highlighting the importance of STEM, but this really gives them a career path, doesn't it, to stay in the region?
That's right, Wade. The interesting thing for universities is a lot's changed with defence. As JK mentioned a moment ago, that defence now see universities and industry as fundamental inputs to capability. That means those relationships that they're looking to develop are less transactional and more continuous and interdependent too. So with that, there's a range of activities that defence want to work with universities. So it's not just about research projects. It is about knowledge exchange, materials exchange, student development, STEM development, participation for Indigenous students and females in engineering subjects as well too. So that then inspires a greater range of output for universities into defence too, and whether those students move into defence and remain in those for their entire career, that's for their choice. But it's certainly an excellent place for students to move out into really critical areas and learn to apply some of that really high-tech knowledge that they get in universities out into defence, and then also into other sectors that mirror closely with defence, ag tech, IoT, communications, and other sectors as well.
And Tony, I wonder, can I just add there, Wayne? I guess one of the things we always talk about this, the other thing is that changes like the fourth industrial revolution and the work that JCU are doing with staff is that all of a sudden the sorts of entrepreneurialism that maybe a decade ago required you to have huge infrastructure investment and a lot of seed capital funding has really changed. And I think I've seen quite a few examples, an increasing number of examples of young Northern Australians, especially who come back, and a company that comes to mind is Speed 3D printing. But in general, that entrepreneurialism, which is, and I guess also COVID-19 has shown this, which is that, the jobs can come to you. You don't necessarily need to come to the jobs. And this is critical for Northern Australia and critical for how we talk to our young people. And some of them, the examples I've heard from some young people where, in some of these STEM areas where they go offshore for 4 or 5 years, gain experience and come back to us and reset up in Northern Australia with something entrepreneurial. And I think that's something we really want to see up there as well.
Yeah, John, absolutely right. I think Northern Australia traditionally has had a really strong attitude, a really strong pioneering spirit. I mean, it's tough, and its survival up here is different from, say, it as it may be in metropolitan areas too. It's competitive, the environment's harsh. But students are being encouraged to not only develop their technologies and think about applying them in other businesses, but develop those technologies into spin-out startups themselves too. So the concept of defence innovation, really important to Northern Australia, really important to universities, but also really important to the Spark. So a lot of the technology that will be tested and developed through the Spark will be, the next technology that form new businesses, and then those students could then become employers.
And I guess, is it fair to say, a question to the panel here, when those problems are being solved and those solutions developed, because it's for, say, defence or even health, it becomes instantly scalable and can also lead to probably, like more advanced manufacturing in the region. So you have a almost ecosystem where research, commercialisation, and then manufacturing all in one area.
So dual use is a really important aspect to defence technology, Wade, there. So we're looking at technologies that can be applied for defence, but also have broader applicability to other sectors.
And one of the things too, Wade, is we're looking at the Spark. It's amazing how out of looking from our defence strategy, and then we've built through the health and knowledge strategy, where else it could go. We're now thinking of the Spark as part of an ecosystem, as Mark was talking about. Just last week, we had the opening of the Smart Precinct. At JCU have Area 61, which is about prototyping and manufacturing, and then you've got the Defence Hub and the Manufacturing Hub. So what we're looking at setting up is an ecosystem in Townsville in North Queensland where a young entrepreneur can come up with an idea. The Smart Precinct will help them develop and start up. They can prototype at Area 61 for the university. They can then do the operational test and development, research and development in the Spark. But then there is the manufacturing hub, the defence hub, to help bring that through, commercialise it and take it through. So we're looking at creating an ecosystem and an environment in North Queensland that can go through the full evolution of a business idea and start that sort of, and a chain and start a supply chain that has potential to go global.
And I've never seen, is it fair to say, the level of collaboration between three of the region's biggest organisations as well, which I think is exciting to see where that could go.
The interesting thing, mate, is when we built it, we talk about it being a physical link between. It's very. We think it's unique where you can build something like the Spark right on the boundary of Army's largest operational base, a leading university, a leading hospital. But what we've found is that everyone's been going through, it's become more than physical. It's actually become a cultural link and collaboration, and it's broken down those barriers. And all of a sudden, parts of defence, parts of are talking to the university. And we've already got Defence Science Technology Group talking to academics, talking to the hospital, and they're saying we can't wait a couple of years for this thing to be built. Let's start collaborating and working together. So we've actually got projects happening. So just the thought of this project, putting it down, has actually broken down the barriers, and it's formed a cultural bridge between all those organisations, and we're starting to see that develop already.
I think it's wonderful to see, David. You touched on another question to the panel here, just about identifying the region's strengths and how our strengths can assist in defence. Just how important is that from a defence point of view?
Look, I might lead off on this one. I think it's critical. I mean, and for those who are afterwards are looking for this is some of the discussion in pieces that are written by John Caligari, myself, and a few others, where this issue of strategic location, the issue of home basing, the issue of available training grounds, and the compromise between all of those is critical. And I guess this is where the other part about it is that you can approach, and this is some of the times in engaging with the state and territories, and it's no point saying that you want to build submarines in Townsville from scratch. It's just no point, even though they're $52 to $82 billion worth of business to be had. It's just not possible. And I think this is where that's the sort of approach where you're working in that sort of the realities of what you've got present in right now and what you can actually build. Having said that, though, it's sometimes a double-edged sword, and I think this is, there's a lot of primes have this argument, which is, Townsville, Darwin, Cairns, there's not a workforce there, or there's not, there's not subcontractors, or there's not other people there to be part of that process. So it can be used as a double sword. But I do like, and some of the conversations I've been having with the Townsville government, with David, really are around this issue of, we're talking about collaboratively working together, and a very different approach than possibly what the traditional approach to defence has been, which is, how many soldiers will you put here, and, how much will you spend in the local community?
It's a really interesting parallel to that too, John, in the industrial perspective as well. So it's not necessarily just about partnerships. So an EOI pops up and a business says, oh, well, I have to have a university involved, or a university says, oh, I have to have a business involved. We're going to just join and chuck in for the COI. It's about developing partnerships, and that language is written into those defence policy documents about longer lasting partnerships where there is longer exchange, and defence rises up with its sovereign industrial base as well. So they come up together and they realise it's essential that needs to happen.
And look, that's really pleasing.
I agree with both John and Tony. The real importance for defence here is that at the moment we have a relationship, for example, between defence and individual organisations in industry and academia, for instance, here in Townsville, between QBIC and JCU and CQU. But by putting all this together into one spot, and in particular because of the synergies that David points out, that you've now got all of those people working in the same place, you'll learn from each other. You'll have police, ambulances, you'll even have, for instance, the potential here for the Pacific Step Up to be bringing Department of Foreign Affairs, to be bringing organisations that need to learn how to do disaster training or disaster command and control with simulators. You put them all in the same place and you actually learn from each other. And Defence is becoming very good at that now, in understanding that Defence only knows what Defence only knows. And the more it can interact and partner with other organisations that are thinking and collaborating together, the better off Defence will be as well.
Great, thanks. I'm just conscious of the time. What I might do, if I can, is just finish with a quick comment from everyone on where they see, you know, the opportunities for the region in relation to defence. David Burke, I might start with you.
What I think is good, and I've been doing this for a year now, and just to see how far we've come in a year, and I think it's just around what John was saying, and I think we're all working together now. We understand that, you know, that we've got a common message, we've got a strategy, we understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. We're doing it in a mutually beneficial way, and all of a sudden now, you know, the opportunities are opening up, and we keep working that way. I think it's a very bright future for us.
Thanks, David. Mark?
Yeah, I applaud the alignment that's occurring between the three levels of government, the fact that we're now targeting strategic opportunities that align with Defence's force structure review. And that's great for the businesses in Townsville. I think for us and other businesses like ours, the development of our training ranges and the utilisation of those training ranges by not just Singapore, but other partners in the Pacific, to include South Korea and potentially Japan, as well as more utilisation by the Australian Defence Force and the United States Marine Corps, is something that we're likely to see, and we're looking forward to providing high-tech solutions to support that regionally.
Thanks very much, Mark. I know, John Coyne, you're about to sign off, so if you have to go, a quick comment, I'll let you go. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry. A back-to-back meeting, which is the nature of Zoom now. They don't give you any time to go anywhere. But look, you know, I sort of sit there. Number one is how pleasing it is to see, and I see it in Townsville and I see it in Darwin, to see the academic sector working with industry, working with government. And I think that's a very pleasing outcome. I think that the next one is about thinking big. You know, when I talk about the spark, and I'm not integrally involved in it, but when I talk about it here in Canberra to people, I go, imagine if we had something like this centre where we could have brought people together for the next time we have an evacuation like Wuhan, you know, and we can run the whole operation with civilians, with everybody through a simulation first. What an amazing opportunity that would be for the future. And so from my perspective, you know, same as the port and several other things within, when we're talking Townsville, Cairns region, is that challenge of thinking big, and how do you draw in the various silos of government to achieve the one thing. But look, thank you very much, and I do appreciate being brought on, so thanks.
Great, John. Thanks for your time. We'll let you go to your next meeting. Thank you.
Cheers,
John Caligari.
I think the benefit here is that, and the change of approach has been that places like Townsville have often seen themselves as the poorer cousins of the regional, the metropolitan areas, and have often thought that what we've got to do is try and is have Defence, which has a lot of money, spend its money how we think it should be spent. What we've done here is align what we think Defence, and having worked with Defence and having a few people here now who have some expertise about what Defence is likely to need, is turn something in Townsville into an opportunity where we know what we want in order to, what the Townsville City Council and the regional councils around here are interested in. That's economic prosperity for their people. Queensland government, of course, is interested in the jobs and the same sort of thing, and the Department of Defence is after security. So this is a win-win-win. All we're after here is what is it that we can benefit from locally to produce that economic benefit for Townsville. It also happens to be a win for the jobs that the state government wants and what the federal government might want here in Townsville. That's why this whole nation building and national security strategy is so important to where we want to go. It's actually all the things that we would want. If Defence wanted it in Townsville, it would buy it. It would pay for it out of its integrated investment plan. If Townsville's got it, if it's in Townsville's interest to do it, and it's worth Defence taking an interest in that because it's in Defence's interest as well, it's a win all round.
Great, thanks very much, John. Finish with you, Tony.
Wade, I just echo what John, Mark and David said there too. John's comment about getting people that work together to realise, you know, that that the collection of all the collaborative activity actually generates something bigger. We've recognised our unique competitive advantage up here in Townsville. We have a base, we have a hospital, we have a university co-located, a willing council, and we have a ready industrial base, most of which we're already communicating with any of those organisations or all of them. So we've essentially got an environment that's ready to go. Defence policy happens to have kicked off in a particular direction that suits that as well. So I think it's all systems go for us up here. We're having conversations, with DST, Defence, other areas of politics within the country, political levels, and the word is getting out that there's a lot of activity happening up in Townsville, and that's being noted by the number of defence companies that have approached me at the university in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, saying, we hear you're doing something, we want to work with you, which we've had that in that number previously. So I think there's a really great opportunity building here, and it'd be great for everyone to get on board.
Yeah, perfectly summed up by all. So thank you very much. We are out of time. It is a big topic. We probably could still keep this panel going for another hour. But I do want to thank our panel, Mark, David, and John. Thank you to Tony. Thank you as well. Really appreciate your time and your expertise and knowledge in this area. And it seems as though, Townsville is certainly in the region leveraging its strengths and collaborating to really send the message out there that we are ideally located and ready to establish these defence industries for the benefit of Australia. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on the webinar. Appreciate your time. The recording will be up on our website tomorrow, so please feel free to jump back on and have a look and pass it on to your networks to share this story about defence in North Queensland. Thanks again for your time. We'll have another webinar next Wednesday, our final one in the Unlock the North series. It will be on health and knowledge with a particular focus of Trop IQ. We touched on a little bit of that today with the simulation park. Okay, have a great afternoon. Thanks again for your company, and we'll see you next week.